The Winchester rifle cracked through the howling blizzard, its muzzle flash illuminating the blood-stained snow for one terrible moment. Silent Rain pressed himself against the collapsed wall of Ember Ridge's abandoned saloon, feeling warm wetness spreading across his left shoulder where the bullet had grazed him. The metallic taste of fear filled his mouth as he counted approaching footsteps, 3 men, maybe 4, moving with practiced stealth. A woman's scream pierced the storm, high and desperate, from the telegraph office. The sound cut through Silent Rain's 28 years of frontier caution like a blade through buckskin. He'd been tracking these hired guns for 3 days, following their bloody trail from Fort Laramie, but hadn't expected civilians. Another shot rang out, followed by crashing timber. Through driving snow, flames began licking at the telegraph office roof. They were burning someone out or alive. The Oglala Lakota warrior wiped blood from his eyes and checked his rifle. 6 rounds left 30 more in his pouch. Not much against professional killers, but it would have to do. He'd been riding scout alone for 9 months, branded a coward by the tribal council for supposedly fleeing during the Crow raid that killed his younger brother, Running Wolf. The truth that he'd been outflanking the enemy didn't matter without witnesses. Only shame remained driving him to seek redemption far from disappointed eyes. Tonight might be his chance to prove himself or his grave. Either way, he couldn't ignore that scream. Silent Rain sprinted across the frozen street moccasins, finding purchase on ice-slicked planks as bullets whined past. The telegraph office leaned dangerously, half its roof collapsed under snow, and whatever explosion had rocked it. Orange flames danced behind broken windows, thick smoke pouring through wall gaps. "Get me out of here," a voice called from within, young female German-accented English. "Please, someone help me. The beam's too heavy and the fire—" Her words dissolved into coughing. Silent Rain squeezed through the twisted door frame splinters, catching his buffalo hide coat. Inside was an inferno of broken furniture and scattered papers, but his eyes went to the far corner where a massive roof beam trapped someone beneath an overturned desk. The woman was perhaps 20, wheat-colored hair, darkened by soot eyes, pale blue as winter sky. Her calico dress was torn and blood-stained. She clutched a waterproof bundle with desperate intensity. Seeing him, her expression shifted from hopeless terror to cautious relief. "You came?" She gasped and then coughed as smoke burned her throat. Silent Rain braced his wounded shoulder against the beam, ignoring lancing pain. The wood was heavy as a dead horse, but adrenaline gave him strength. He heaved upward, muscles straining until timber shifted enough for her to drag free. "Can you walk?" he asked, helping her up. She tested weight on her left ankle and collapsed with a sharp cry. Twisted when the roof came down. Those men, they were asking about telegraph messages, something I decoded. "What kind of messages?" "Military codes. Plans for an attack on Indian families." Her voice was urgent despite obvious pain. "Tomorrow night at Devil's Draw. They're going to massacre women and children and blame it on hostile raiders." Silent Rain went very still. Devil's Draw was where his cousin Iron Bear wintered with extended family, the same Iron Bear who'd spoken against him at tribal council, but whose twin daughters had once called Silent Rain their favorite uncle. "Who's planning this?" "Indian Agent Pike and a cattleman named Vane. I have proof." She clutched the bundle tighter. "But they found out I was listening. Been hunting me 3 days." Voices outside grew closer, accompanied by boots crunching snow. Silent Rain smelled kerosene over wood smoke. They were preparing to burn the building around them. "Can you hold on to me?" She nodded, though her face was gray with pain and smoke. Silent Rain crouched with his back to her. "Climb on. Whatever happens, don't let go of those papers or me." She wrapped arms around his neck bundle pressed between them. He felt her heart hammering as he lifted her weight and moved toward the rear window. Glass had been shot out, leaving jagged shards. "Here they come," a voice shouted from the front. "Torch the whole place." Silent Rain knocked away remaining glass with his rifle butt and boosted her through. Flames spread rapidly, filling the office with choking smoke and unbearable heat. He followed just as kerosene-fed fire engulfed where they'd been standing. His horse, a sturdy paint mare named Crow Feather, waited in the alley where he'd left her dancing nervously but holding ground. "Easy, girl," he murmured, catching reins while supporting the woman. "We've got trouble coming." He lifted her onto the mare's back, then swung up behind. 3 men rounded the burning building's corner, faces twisted with rage. "There, the Indians got her." Muzzle flashes lit the alley like lightning as bullets sang through air. Silent Rain spurred Crow Feather into a gallop, leaning low over the woman's shoulder as they raced through abandoned buildings. One bullet tugged his sleeve, another splintered wood inches from his head, but somehow they reached town's edge without taking fatal hits. Behind them, angry shouts and pursuit thunder echoed through the storm. The gunmen's horses were fresh, while Crow Feather had been traveling hard. But Silent Rain had advantages, intimate country knowledge, and a storm to cover tracks. They plunged into the blizzard's teeth, leaving ember ridges burning buildings as wind and snow swallowed them in white obscurity. The woman pressed her face against Silent Rain's neck, breath warm despite bitter cold surrounding them. "What's your name?" she asked, shouting over howling wind. "Silent Rain. You?" "Clara Reinhardt." She shifted the bundle for better grip. "Where are we going?" "Away from them. Then we figure out how to stop this attack." They rode hard for hours, following game trails and creek beds difficult to track in the storm. Clara's injured ankle throbbed with each step, but she gritted teeth and held on. The alternative, falling into Pike's killer's hands, was too terrible to contemplate. When they finally found shelter in a wind-carved hollow beneath sandstone overhang, both were half-frozen and exhausted. Silent Rain built a small fire from dead wood, while Clara examined her bundle by flickering light. "Thank God," she breathed, checking papers. "It's all here. Coded messages, Pike's personal notes even." She paused, holding up German script. "Even this." "What is it?" Clara's voice strained. "A letter from my father. Klaus Reinhardt. I thought he was dead. He left me with missionaries 8 years ago and never came back. But this is dated 2 months ago." She translated halting German words. "He warns about the attack, mentions mine flooding, says he's trapped at Ghostwind, and Pike is using him for engineering work against his will." Silent Rain studied the unreadable letter. "Pike had this. Must have intercepted it. Which means my father's alive, and he's been trying to warn me." Clara's voice broke slightly. "All these years I thought he abandoned me, but he was protecting me from this." The implications staggered. If Klaus Reinhardt was alive with inside conspiracy knowledge, he could provide testimony to destroy Pike completely. But he was also a hostage whose life hung by a thread. As they huddled around their small fire, neither realized they were being tracked by more than hired guns. 3 miles away, trained bloodhounds followed their scent through snow, led by scarred tracker Wolf McNeil, who'd earned his reputation hunting escaped slaves before the war. The pack of 6 riders included someone Clara and Silent Rain trusted, someone who'd been feeding information to Pike all along. Sergeant Tom Morrison rode beside McNeil, his weathered face showing no emotion as he studied tracks in the snow. For months, he'd been Pike's inside man in the territorial militia, carefully positioned to feed intelligence and misdirect any investigations that got too close to the conspiracy. "How much farther?" asked Bennett, leader of Pike's killers. "Hour, maybe 2, McNeil replied, patting a hound's massive head. "These beauties ain't lost a trail yet." Morrison spoke up, his voice carefully neutral. "The Indian's wounded, there's blood in the tracks. And the woman's ankle is slowing them down. They can't run much longer." Bennett nodded approvingly. Morrison had proven invaluable in tracking down witnesses and potential threats to Pike's operation. The sergeant's military credentials gave him access to information and resources that street thugs could never obtain. "When we catch them," Bennett continued, "Pike wants the woman taken alive if possible. She might know about other copies of those documents. But the Indian..." He shrugged. "One less redskin in the territory won't break my heart." Morrison said nothing, but privately he was beginning to have doubts about the conspiracy he'd joined. Killing corrupt officials and criminal witnesses was one thing, but the planned massacre at Devil's Draw included women and children. That crossed a line even for a man who'd sold his honor for Pike's gold. Still, he was in too deep to back out now. Pike knew about Morrison's gambling debts and his theft of military supplies to pay them off. One word from the Indian agent would end Morrison's career and land him in territorial prison. The attack came at dawn, just as Silent Rain had anticipated. He'd been tracking their pursuers for the past hour, using Lakota hunting techniques to move silently through forest, while Clara waited in shelter. When he saw the dogs and realized their pursuit's nature, he knew conventional flight was impossible. Instead, he chose to fight on ground of his choosing. The trap was simple: a deadfall triggered by tripwire positioned where trail narrowed between large boulders. When the lead dog hit the wire, a massive log crashed from above, killing the animal instantly and blocking the path. Remaining hounds went wild, baying and snarling as they scented blood. In the confusion, Silent Rain put 2 quick shots into the pack, dropping the largest dogs before melting back into forest like a ghost. "That damn Indian's got more fight than I figured, McNeil cursed, trying to control surviving animals. But he just made this personal. Bennett dismounted and studied the scene with professional appreciation. Smart. He's trying to even odds. He turned to his men. "Williams, Carter, circle east. Morrison, you come with me. We'll squeeze him between us." But Silent Rain had no intention of being squeezed. Using skills learned in childhood and perfected in warfare, he led pursuers deeper into hills, leaving a trail of small ambushes and clever traps. A snare caught Williams' horse, sending its rider tumbling into a ravine. A carefully placed shot shattered Carter's rifle stock, leaving him armed only with a pistol. By mid-morning, Bennett's force was reduced to 4 effective men, and they were beginning to understand they hunted a predator, not prey. "This ain't working," Carter muttered, checking ammunition. "That redskin's picking us apart piece by piece." Bennett's jaw tightened with frustration. "Then we changed tactics. McNeil, can those dogs track back to where they came from?" The scarred tracker nodded. "Sure enough." "Why?" "Because while we've been chasing the Indian, that German gal's been sitting alone in their camp. Time we reminded him what's at stake." Morrison felt a chill as he realized Bennett's strategy. They couldn't catch Silent Rain in open forest, so they'd force him to come to them by threatening the woman he'd risked everything to save. The sergeant found himself hoping the warrior would somehow reach Clara first. Silent Rain was a mile away, setting another ambush, when he heard distant dogs baying on a new trail, one leading directly back to Clara. His blood went cold as he realized Bennett's strategy. He ran, then abandoning stealth for speed, crashing through underbrush and leaping fallen logs in desperate race to reach Clara before Pike's killers did. But even as he ran, he knew he might already be too late. Clara heard dogs coming long before she saw them. The sound sent ice through her veins, not just because of immediate danger, but because it awakened childhood memories of slave catchers using similar packs. She gathered their supplies and looked for somewhere to hide, but the shelter offered no concealment from trained hunting animals. The first dog appeared at the entrance like something from Nightmare, a massive mastiff with scarred flanks and yellow eyes that fixed on her with predatory hunger. Behind it came two more hounds, as then the men. Bennett stepped into the shelter with rifle trained on Clara's chest. His smile was cold as winter moonlight. "Miss Reinhardt, so good to finally meet you properly." He gestured with his weapon. "Now why don't you hand over those papers like a good girl, and maybe we can avoid unpleasantness." "Go to hell," Clara replied, clutching the bundle tighter. Bennett's smile widened. "Oh, I do admire spirit in a woman. Makes breaking them so much more satisfying." He nodded to McNeil. "Let the dogs smell her, nice and slow." The tracker grinned and released his grip on the nearest hound's collar. The massive animal patted forward lips, drawn back, revealing yellowed fangs. Clara could smell its breath, raw meat and corruption, as it approached. "Last chance, miss," Bennett said conversationally. "Those papers, or I let my friends here have their fun." Clara closed her eyes and prepared for the worst. But instead of tearing pain, she heard a wet thud, followed by a man's scream. Her eyes snapped open to see Silent Rain standing in the entrance, his knife dripping blood. McNeil was on the ground, clutching his throat and making horrible gurgling sounds. The dogs, confused by their master's sudden collapse, milled uncertainly. "Let her go," Silent Rain said quietly, rifle now trained on Bennett's head. Bennett laughed. "One man against four? I don't think so, boy." "Look behind you." Bennett's companions turned to find themselves staring down barrels of two Army rifles. Deputy Walt Wade and Sergeant Morrison had arrived just in time, drawn by gunfire. Clara felt relief wash over her, but Silent Rain's eyes narrowed as he studied Morrison's face. Something about the sergeant's expression, a flicker of calculation, a moment's hesitation, set off alarm bells in the warrior's mind. "Drop your weapons," Wade ordered. For a moment it seemed Bennett might comply. Then his face twisted with rage, and he swung his rifle toward Clara. "If I can't have those papers, then nobody—" Silent Rain's shot took him in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the shelter wall. He slid to the ground, weapon clattering across stone floor. The remaining hired gun threw down his pistol immediately. "Don't shoot, I surrender." In the sudden silence, Clara found herself shaking uncontrollably. 3 days of terror and flight had finally caught up with her, and she collapsed into Silent Rain's arms, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. "It's over," he murmured, holding her close. "You're safe now." But even as he spoke those words, Silent Rain's eyes remained fixed on Morrison. The sergeant had positioned himself where he could watch all of them, his rifle held with professional readiness. Something about the man's demeanor suggested this encounter wasn't as random as it appeared. Deputy Wade examined papers Clara had fought to protect his weathered face, growing grim as he read Pike's coded communications. "Sweet mercy," he breathed. "This is worse than we thought. Pike's not just planning to attack Devil's Draw, he's got similar operations planned across 3 territories." "What do you mean?" Clara asked. "Look at these dates." Wade pointed to telegrams. "Coordinated attacks on native settlements, all blamed on rogue military units. The plan is to make it look like the army's gone completely out of control, slaughtering civilians without orders." Silent Rain studied documents with growing horror. "Why would Pike want that?" Because it would force Washington to remove all tribal protections. Morrison replied, his voice carefully neutral. Make it legal for cattlemen like Vane to take whatever land they wanted. Millions of acres would be opened for settlement and grazing. Wade nodded grimly. We need to get this evidence to Fort Laramie. Colonel Harrison has authority to arrest Pike and shut down this whole operation. What about my father? Clara asked. If Pike realizes we've escaped with the evidence. Wade's expression was sympathetic but realistic. Miss, I know this is hard to hear, but your father's been missing 2 months. The chances he's still alive. He is alive, Clara interrupted fiercely. I know he is. That letter was written weeks ago. Silent Rain studied the letter again, noting details missed in earlier haste. Wade, look at this. The paper, the ink, this was written on official Indian Agency stationery. Klaus Reinhardt wasn't just being held prisoner, he was being forced to work on Pike's engineering projects. Morrison stepped closer, studying the German text with apparent interest. What kind of projects? Mine flooding. Clara replied, translating more of her father's words. He mentions specific techniques for controlled flooding ways to make it look accidental. Her face went pale. Oh, God. Pike's been using him to destroy evidence to make murders look like mining accidents. The implications chilled everyone present. If Pike had been systematically eliminating witnesses by staging accidental mine collapses, then Klaus Reinhardt's specialized knowledge made him both invaluable and extremely dangerous to the conspiracy. Morrison spoke up, his tone reasonable and helpful. We should split up. I'll take the evidence to Fort Laramie while you folks go after Clara's father. That way, we cover both bases. Silent Rain's suspicions crystallized instantly. Something about Morrison's eagerness to separate them from the evidence set off every instinct the warrior possessed. No, Silent Rain said firmly. We stay together, all of us. Morrison's face flickered with annoyance before resuming its helpful expression. That's not very efficient. Time's running out and we stay together. Silent Rain repeated, his hand moving subtly toward his knife. Wade looked between the two men, sensing tension, but not understanding its source. What's the problem? Morrison's right, splitting up makes tactical sense. Maybe, Silent Rain replied carefully. But I don't trust anyone with those papers except Clara. She's earned the right to see this through to the end. Clara noticed the undercurrent of suspicion in Silent Rain's voice and found herself studying Morrison more carefully. The sergeant was clean-shaven and professional-looking, with the bearing of a career soldier. Nothing about him seemed obviously threatening, but Silent Rain's instincts had kept them alive so far. We go to Ghostwind together, Clara said finally. All of us. Morrison's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded with apparent reluctance. If that's what you want. But we're losing valuable time. The journey to Ghostwind Mine took them through landscapes designed to test human endurance. Frozen rivers had to be crossed on treacherous ice mountain passes, where one wrong step meant 100-foot fall forests so thick with snow-laden branches that riders had to dismount and lead horses through the maze. But it was the human obstacles that proved most dangerous. Pike had realized by now that Bennett's team had failed, and he dispatched every available gun to intercept Clara and her evidence before it could reach federal authorities. The territorial telegraph lines buzzed with coded messages offering rewards for their capture, dead or alive. Morrison, riding beside them, as a trusted ally, made subtle suggestions about routes and timing that would have led them directly into several ambushes. Each time, Silent Rain's suspicious nature and knowledge of the country steered them away from danger. You sure about this trail? Morrison asked as they approached Eagle Creek. Looks like it might be watched. Silent Rain studied the terrain with tactical eyes, noting excellent positions for ambushers in the rocks above the narrow bridge. You're right. We'll cross downstream where the ice is thicker. Morrison's face showed momentary frustration before resuming its helpful mask. Whatever you think is best. You know this country better than I do. But as they detoured around the bridge, Silent Rain spotted rifle barrels glinting in the rocks, exactly where Morrison had suggested they go. The warrior's suspicions hardened into certainty. Sergeant Tom Morrison was Pike's inside man, and he'd been trying to lead them into a trap. The realization posed a terrible dilemma. Confronting Morrison directly would force a gunfight they might not win, but allowing him to continue guiding them would eventually lead to capture or death. Silent Rain needed to warn Wade and Clara without alerting the sergeant to his suspicions. As they made camp that evening in a sheltered valley, Silent Rain found an opportunity to speak privately with Clara while she tended to Crow Feather. "Don't react," he said quietly, checking the mare's hooves. "Just keep doing what you're doing. But Morrison's working for Pike." Clara's hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their work. "Are you sure? Every route he suggested would have led us into ambushes. He's been trying to separate us from the evidence since we found him. And he knew too much about Pike's operation details that weren't in those documents." Clara felt ice form in her stomach as she realized the implications. "What do we do?" "Keep acting normal. I'll find a way to deal with him when the time comes." But Morrison had noticed their whispered conversation and was drawing his own conclusions. That night, as the others slept around their small fire, he made his move. Clara woke to cold steel pressed against her throat and Morrison's voice hissing in her ear. "Don't move, don't speak, don't even breathe hard," he whispered. "I've got a knife at your neck, and I'll use it if anyone tries to be heroic." Silent Rain and Wade were already awake, their hands moving instinctively toward weapons before freezing as they saw Clara's predicament. "That's right." Morrison said, his helpful facade completely gone. "Now we're going to have an honest conversation about those documents and where they're really going." Wade's face showed shock and betrayal. "Tom, what the hell are you doing?" "What I should have done from the beginning, protecting my investment." Morrison's voice was bitter. "You think I enjoyed playing nursemaid to a bunch of doomed fools. Pike's operation is the future of this territory, and I'd rather be on the winning side." "You sold out your own uniform," Wade said with disgust. "Betrayed everything you swore to defend." Morrison laughed harshly. "My uniform, my oath. Where were they when I needed money to pay gambling debts? When I was facing court-martial for theft, Pike offered me a way out, and I took it." Silent Rain had been edging slowly closer during this exchange, but Morrison pressed the knife deeper against Clara's throat, drawing a thin line of blood. "Don't even think about it, Indian. I know your reputation, but you're not fast enough to save her if I decide to open her up." Clara felt the blade's edge and forced herself to remain perfectly still. But her mind was racing, looking for any opportunity to escape or create a distraction. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. "Those documents, obviously. Pike needs to know exactly what evidence you have so he can neutralize it." Morrison's tone was businesslike now. "Hand them over and maybe you'll live long enough to see your father again." "My father's alive. For now. Pike's been keeping him as insurance, making sure his engineering expertise stays available. But if you don't cooperate..." Morrison let the implication hang in the air. Clara's heart hammered with desperate hope and terror. Her father was alive, but his life depended on her next decision. She looked at Silent Rain, seeing the warrior calculating distances and angles, waiting for any chance to strike. "The documents are in my saddlebags," she said finally. Morrison smiled coldly. "I know. Wade, you're going to walk over there very slowly and bring them to me. Any sudden moves, and this pretty lady gets a new smile from ear to ear." Wade moved with careful deliberation toward Clara's horse, his face showing the pain of betrayal. He'd served with Morrison for 3 years, trusted him with his life on multiple occasions, and the sergeant's treachery cut deep. But as Wade reached for the saddlebags, Silent Rain made his move. The warrior had been waiting for Morrison to focus entirely on Wade's movements. When the sergeant's attention shifted for just an instant, Silent Rain lunged forward with lightning speed. Morrison felt the attack coming and tried to pull his knife across Clara's throat, but Silent Rain's hand clamped down on his wrist with bone-crushing force. The two men struggled violently, rolling away from Clara as they fought for control of the blade. Clara scrambled clear as Wade drew his pistol, but he couldn't get a clear shot with the two men grappling in the firelight. Morrison was larger and stronger than Silent Rain, but the warrior had years of close-quarters combat experience. The fight was brutal and decisive. Silent Rain managed to twist Morrison's wrist until the sergeant dropped his knife, then delivered a devastating blow to the man's temple with the pommel of his own blade. Morrison collapsed unconscious, but alive. "Tie him up." Silent Rain ordered, breathing hard from the struggle. "We'll need him to testify about Pike's operation." Wade bound Morrison's hands and feet with practiced efficiency, his face still showing shock at his partner's betrayal. 3 years I served with this snake. 3 years I trusted him to watch my back. He was probably feeding information to Pike the whole time," Clara said, touching the thin cut on her throat. "No wonder the cavalry patrol never showed up to help us." Silent Rain nodded grimly. "Which means Pike knows exactly where we are and what we're doing. Ghostwind Mine is going to be a trap." "Then we spring it on our terms," Wade replied, checking his weapons. "But first, let's see what our friend here knows about Pike's current plans." They woke Morrison with cold water from their canteens. The sergeant was groggy and disoriented, but his eyes quickly focused when he saw their faces. "You're making a mistake," he said thickly. "Pike's got more men than you can imagine. You can't possibly—" "How many?" Silent Rain interrupted. Morrison smiled nastily. "Enough. And they're all professionals, not like Bennett's street thugs. You walk into Ghostwind, you walk into your graves." Clara leaned closer, her voice deadly serious. "Is my father really alive?" Morrison studied her face, seeming to weigh his options. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah, he's alive. Pike needs his expertise for one final job. After that—" He shrugged. "What kind of job?" "Flooding the mine with the evidence buried inside. Making it look like a natural disaster that happened to claim some unfortunate trespassers." Morrison's smile was cruel. "Your father's going to help Pike stage your deaths whether he wants to or not." The implications were staggering. Pike wasn't just planning to kill them, he was going to use Klaus Reinhardt's engineering knowledge to make their deaths look accidental, while simultaneously destroying all evidence of the conspiracy. "How many men does Pike have at the mine?" Wade demanded. Morrison considered refusing to answer, then shrugged. "What difference does it make? You're going anyway, aren't you? 12, maybe 15? All positioned in defensive positions around the main shaft." Silent Rain exchanged glances with Wade and Clara. 15 professional gunmen in prepared positions would be nearly impossible to overcome through direct assault. "There has to be another way in," Clara said. My father's letter mentioned flooding tunnels. There must be multiple entrances. Morrison laughed harshly. Sure, if you don't mind drowning. Pike's been systematically flooding the lower levels for weeks. Most of the side tunnels are under 10 feet of water by now. But Silent Rain was studying the German letter with new understanding. Your father's an engineer. He wouldn't just mention the flooding as a problem, he'd mention it as a solution. Clara looked at the letter again, focusing on technical details she'd skimmed over before. You're right. He's not just describing what Pike is doing, he's describing how to reverse it. The realization opened up new possibilities. If they could somehow access the mine's engineering controls, they might be able to turn Pike's own trap against him. We need to reach my father first, Clara said, before Pike realizes we're there. Wade checked his weapons one final time. Then we better get moving. Morrison's escape attempt means Pike knows we're coming. They left the bound sergeant tied to a tree with enough food and water to last several days. If they succeeded in stopping Pike, they'd send someone back for him. If they failed, Morrison would eventually work his way free and escape to face whatever justice the territory could provide. The final approach to Ghost Wind Mine took them through a landscape scarred by human greed. Open pits, slag heaps, and abandoned equipment dotted the mountainside like festering wounds. Poisoned water seeped from tunnel entrances, staining snow with streaks of orange and yellow. But it was the silence that was most unsettling. Mining camps were supposed to be noisy places full of machinery and shouting workers. Ghost Wind was quiet as a cemetery. Something's wrong, Wade muttered, studying deserted buildings through field glasses. No smoke from chimneys, no movement anywhere. Silent Rain reached the same conclusion. They've cleared out the workers. Probably moved them somewhere else while they finish whatever they're doing here. What about my father? Clara asked desperately. We'll find him. Silent Rain promised, though privately, he feared the worst. They approached the main mine entrance with extreme caution weapons ready and nerves stretched tight. The massive wooden head frame loomed above them like a gallows cables disappearing into black depths. Hello, the mine, Wade called out. Federal officers, anyone down there? His voice echoed into depths without response. Whatever was happening in Ghost Wind Mine was happening in absolute silence. Clara started toward the main shaft, but Silent Rain caught her arm. Wait, he said. Look at the ground. Fresh tracks led away from the mine entrance, not heavy boots of miners, but lighter impressions of someone being dragged against their will. The trail led toward a smaller shaft on the far side of the complex. They followed tracks through the maze of abandoned equipment, past rusting ore cars and collapsed buildings. The smaller shaft was partially hidden behind stacked timber, as if someone had tried to conceal its entrance. Down there, Wade whispered, pointing to faint glow visible far below. Someone's got a lamp burning. They could hear voices now, men talking in low, urgent tones. But over conversation came another sound that made Clara's blood run cold, steady dripping of water growing louder by the minute. They're flooding the mine, she realized with horror. Just like the letter said. Silent Rain was already rigging rope around the head frame. Wade, stay up here and watch for trouble. Clara and I are going down. Like hell you are, Wade protested. That shaft could collapse any second. Then we better hurry. The descent into Ghost Wind Mine was like entering the underworld itself. Their lantern cast dancing shadows on rough-hewn walls, and the sound of dripping water grew steadily louder as they descended. Clara's injured ankle throbbed with each step, but she gritted teeth and kept moving. 50 feet down, they found the first body. The dead man wore miner's clothes, but his hands were soft and ink-stained, clearly not someone who'd spent his life with pick and shovel. More bodies lay scattered through the tunnel, all killed by gunshots to the back of the head. Witnesses. Silent Rain said grimly. Pike's been cleaning house. They pressed deeper into the mine, following voices and the increasingly urgent drip of water. The tunnel branched several times, but the main passage continued descending toward flooded lower levels. Finally, they saw light ahead, not flickering glow of a single lantern, but steady illumination of multiple oil lamps. Voices became clearer as they approached, and Clara's heart leaped as she recognized one of them. Her father was alive. Klaus Reinhardt sat chained to a support beam in a large chamber, serving as the mine's underground office. Papers and engineering drawings were scattered across a makeshift desk, and several men stood around him with guns drawn. But it was the sight of water seeping through cracks in the chamber wall that made Clara's blood turn to ice. The flooding her father had written about wasn't some distant threat, it was happening right now. And they were all going to die if they didn't get out soon. "I've done everything you asked," Klaus said in heavily accented English. "The calculations are complete, the charges are placed. Just let me go." "I'm afraid that's not possible, Professor," replied a smooth voice belonging to Indian Agent Pike himself. "You see, you know too much about our operation, and dead men tell no tales." Pike was tall and distinguished-looking, with graying hair and a politician's bearing. He wore expensive clothes and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to power. But his eyes were cold as a snake's, and Clara could see calculating cruelty lurking beneath his civilized exterior. "Besides," Pike continued conversationally, "your work here isn't quite finished. We still need you to trigger the final flood sequence. Make it look like a natural disaster, of course. Tragic accident that claims the life of a brilliant engineer who was trying to help develop the territory's mineral resources." Klaus Reinhardt's shoulders sagged with defeat. "You'll never get away with this. People will ask questions about the families at Devil's Draw, about all the witnesses you've killed." "What witnesses?" Pike smiled coldly. "A few rogue Indians who attacked innocent settlers, some dangerous criminals who died resisting arrest. My dear Professor, by the time this is over, I'll be hailed as a hero for bringing peace to the frontier." Clara had heard enough. Clara had heard. She started forward, but Silent Rain caught her arm and shook his head. They were outnumbered 4-1, and rushing in blindly would only get them all killed. Instead, he motioned for her to stay hidden while he worked his way around to the far side of the chamber. If he could create a distraction, maybe Clara could free her father while he dealt with Pike's men. Pike had planned this final scene with theatrical precision. The mine chamber was rigged with explosives that would bring down supporting timbers and allow controlled flooding of the entire complex. Klaus Reinhardt's engineering expertise had been used to calculate exactly how much water pressure would be needed to make the disaster look natural, while ensuring that any evidence of the conspiracy would be buried under tons of rock and mud. "You have 30 minutes to rig the final charges," Pike told Klaus. "After that, we'll be far enough away to avoid the flooding. You unfortunately will be found among the tragic victims of this terrible accident." Klaus looked up at his captor with weary defiance. "And what about the families at Devil's Draw? Are they also going to suffer terrible accidents?" Pike's smile was genuinely pleased. "Oh, that's the beautiful part, Professor. Thanks to your daughter's meddling, I've had to modify the plan somewhat. But the end result will be even better." He gestured to one of his men who produced a bundle of familiar-looking papers. Clara's heart sank as she recognized her own handwriting among the documents. Somehow Pike had obtained copies of the evidence she'd fought so hard to protect. Your daughter's proof of my conspiracy has been very useful, Pike continued. I've been able to doctor the documents to make it appear that Iron Bear and his followers were actually planning to attack white settlements. When my men arrive at Devil's Draw tomorrow night, they'll be acting on solid intelligence about an imminent Indian uprising. Klaus Reinhardt's face went pale as he understood the full scope of Pike's manipulation. You're going to use my daughter's evidence to justify massacring innocent people. Justify, my dear professor. I'm going to be forced to take defensive action against a proven threat. The modified documents clearly show that Iron Bear's band was planning coordinated attacks across the territory. My response will be entirely reasonable and legal. As Pike explained his revised plan, Silent Rain worked his way through the shadows toward the chamber's far end. The mine's layout was complex with multiple levels and interconnecting tunnels, but Pike's men had positioned themselves to control all obvious approaches. What they hadn't counted on was a Lakota warrior trained in stealth and patience. Silent Rain reached a position behind a stack of mining equipment where he could observe the entire chamber. Pike had 4 gunmen with him, all professionals who kept their weapons ready and eyes alert. A direct assault would be suicide, but maybe he could create enough confusion for Clara to reach her father. He was preparing to make his move when disaster struck from an unexpected direction. The water pressure building behind the chamber's weakened walls finally exceeded their structural limits. With a thunderous crack, the eastern walls split open, and a torrent of muddy water poured into the chamber. Pike's men scrambled for higher ground as the flood surged across the chamber floor. Oil lamps were knocked over, plunging much of the space into flickering darkness. In the chaos, Silent Rain made his move. The warrior emerged from shadows like an avenging spirit, his knife finding the nearest gunman's back before the man could react. A second attacker turned toward the commotion and took Silent Rain's throwing knife in the chest. But the remaining 2 gunmen were professionals who didn't panic easily. They opened fire immediately, their muzzle flashes providing stroboscopic illumination of the flooding chamber. Silent Rain dove behind an overturned desk as bullets splintered wood around him. He could see Clara working desperately to free her father's chains, while Pike himself had drawn a pistol and was advancing through the rising water. The flood was accelerating now, pouring through the broken wall with increasing force. What had been ankle-deep water minutes before was now waist-deep and rising fast. The chamber's lower levels were completely submerged, and the torrent was carrying debris that made movement dangerous. Klaus Reinhardt's chains were old and rusty, weakened by weeks of dampness. Clara managed to work one manacle loose, but the second proved more stubborn. "Clara," her father shouted over the roar of rushing water. "You have to leave me. The upper levels are going to flood in minutes." "I'm not leaving you," Clara replied fiercely, still working at the stubborn chain. Pike waded through the deepening water toward them, his pistol trained on Clara's head. "Touching reunion," he called out mockingly. "But I'm afraid it's going to be brief." Silent Rain tried to line up a shot from his position behind the desk, but the flickering light and swirling water made accuracy impossible. He needed to get closer, but Pike's remaining gunmen had him pinned down with carefully placed shots. That's when Klaus Reinhardt proved that engineering knowledge could be as dangerous as any weapon. "Pike!" the older man shouted. "You fool, you've ruptured the main water reservoir. The entire mine is going to flood, not just the lower levels." Pike paused, his confidence flickering as he processed this information. "What are you talking about?" "The wall you just broke, it was holding back millions of gallons of groundwater. I calculated the pressure loads weeks ago. If that barrier fails completely, every tunnel in this mine will be under 20 feet of water within an hour." The implications hit Pike like a physical blow. His carefully planned accident was about to become a real disaster that would claim his own life along with his victims. "You're lying," Pike snarled, but doubt was creeping into his voice. Klaus pointed to the engineering diagrams scattered across his makeshift desk, now partially submerged in the rising flood. "Check the calculations yourself. The water table in this region is nearly at surface level. That's why the mining operation failed in the first place." Pike snatched up the waterlogged papers, trying to read Klaus's technical notes by lamplight, while water swirled around his waist. What he saw made his face go pale. The German engineer was right. The mine flooding wasn't going to be the controlled disaster Pike had planned. It was going to be a catastrophic failure that would bury the entire mountainside under an underground lake. "How long do we have?" Pike demanded. "At current flood rate, maybe 30 minutes before the tunnels are impassable. Less if more walls collapse." Pike's carefully constructed plan was falling apart around him, but he was too intelligent to panic. Instead, he began calculating new possibilities. "Then we all leave together," he decided. "You're going to guide us out of here, Professor. And if you try any tricks, your daughter dies." But Pike had made a crucial error in his revised plan. In his desperation to escape the flood, he'd forgotten about Silent Rain. The Lakota warrior had been using the confusion and noise to work his way closer to Pike's position. When the Indian agent turned his full attention to Klaus and the engineering diagrams, Silent Rain struck. The attack came from Pike's blind side, launched from deep water, where the agent couldn't see movement clearly. Silent Rain's knife took Pike in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into the flood. Pike was tough and experienced and even wounded. He fought with desperate strength. The two men grappled in the chest-deep water, each trying to gain advantage while the flood continued rising around them. Pike managed to get his hands around Silent Rain's throat, using his greater size and weight to force the warrior underwater. Silent Rain fought back with every technique he'd learned in years of combat. But the cold water was sapping his strength, and Pike's grip was like iron. Clara saw Silent Rain disappearing beneath the surface and made a desperate decision. She abandoned her father's remaining chain and launched herself at Pike, her hands clawing for his eyes. The Indian agent was forced to release Silent Rain to deal with this new attack, but Clara was no match for his size and training. He backhanded her across the face, sending her sprawling into the water. That was his final mistake. Silent Rain surfaced like an erupting geyser, his lungs burning but his knife hand steady. The blade took Pike just below the ribs, angling upward toward his heart. Pike looked down at the growing red stains spreading across his white shirt, his face showing more surprise than pain. "This isn't how it was supposed to end," he said quietly. "No." Silent Rain replied, supporting Clara as she struggled to her feet. "It's how it had to end." Pike collapsed backward into the flood, his blood mingling with the muddy water as his body disappeared beneath the surface. But their victory was hollow if they couldn't escape the mine before it filled completely. The water was now chest-deep and rising with alarming speed. Klaus Reinhardt's remaining chain was completely underwater, and the current was strong enough to knock them off their feet. "The chain!" Clara gasped, diving underwater to continue working at her father's bonds. Silent Rain joined her, his knife blade working at the corroded metal, while they both fought to hold their breath in the murky water. The chain was weakened by rust and constant dampness, but it was still too strong to break by hand. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the last link parted. Klaus Reinhardt was free, but the chamber was now almost completely flooded. Only a few feet of airspace remained near the ceiling. "Which way out?" Silent Rain shouted over the roar of rushing water. Klaus pointed toward a tunnel entrance that was still partially above water level. That leads to the main shaft, but we have to move now." The escape from Ghost Wind Mine became a nightmare of endurance and pure terror. The tunnel Klaus had indicated was rapidly filling with water, forcing them to swim rather than walk. Several times they had to dive completely underwater to pass beneath collapsed beams or debris piles. Silent Rain's wounded shoulder made swimming difficult, and Clara's injured ankle was agony every time she kicked. But Klaus Reinhardt, despite his weeks of captivity, proved surprisingly resilient. His engineering knowledge of the mine's layout kept them moving in the right direction even when landmarks disappeared beneath the flood. They reached the main shaft just as water began pouring down from the upper levels. The rope Silent Rain had rigged earlier was still hanging from the headframe, but it was 50 feet above the rising water level. "I can't climb that." Klaus admitted his strength finally failing. "My hands. The chains damage the nerves. I don't have the grip strength." Silent Rain studied the shaft walls looking for alternative routes. The wooden framework was old and partially rotted, but there were iron brackets and cable anchors that might serve as handholds. There, he pointed to a series of mounting points that zigzagged up the shaft wall. "We can use those. It'll be dangerous, but it's possible." The climb out of Ghost Wind Mine was the longest 30 minutes of Clara's life. Her father went first with Silent Rain close behind to catch him if he fell. Clara brought up the rear, her bundle of evidence somehow still clutched against her chest, despite everything they'd been through. Twice rotting timber gave way under their weight, sending them scrambling for new handholds as debris crashed into the flooded depths below. Once Klaus's grip failed completely, and only Silent Rain's quick grab saved him from a fatal fall. But somehow, impossibly, they made it to the surface, just as the final series of internal collapses brought down the entire lower level of the mine. Water poured from every tunnel entrance as the mountain's underground streams found new channels through the collapsed workings. Wade was waiting for them with horses and medical supplies, having heard the underground explosions and feared the worst. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Wade breathed as they hauled the 3 survivors away from the collapsing mine. "We thought you were all dead." "Pike?" he asked. "Dead," Silent Rain replied simply, "along with his immediate crew. But the conspiracy is bigger than just him." Clara opened her waterproof bundle and examined the documents by lantern light. Most had survived their underground ordeal, and the evidence of Pike's plan to attack native settlements was still clearly readable. "This should be enough to stop the attacks," she said with relief. "But we need to get word to Fort Laramie immediately." Klaus Reinhardt, despite his ordeal, was studying Pike's engineering notes with professional interest. "Mein Gott," he breathed. This was not just about land rights. Look at these mineral surveys. This region contains one of the largest silver deposits in the entire territory. Pike and his associates were planning to claim millions of dollars worth of mining rights after the Indian families were driven away or killed. The scope of the conspiracy was even larger than they'd imagined. Pike had been planning systematic genocide to facilitate one of the biggest land grabs in American history. As they prepared to ride toward Fort Laramie with their evidence, Silent Rain noticed something that made his blood run cold. "The body we left down there," he said slowly. "I never actually checked to make sure Pike was dead." Wade looked back at the flooded mine entrance. Water was still pouring from the tunnels, but there was no sign of any human remains among the debris. "He went under when I stabbed him," Silent Rain continued. "But that doesn't mean he drowned. Pike was tough, and he knew those tunnels better than anyone." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You think he escaped?" "I think we can't assume anything where Pike is concerned. The man was a master of deception and misdirection. For all we know, his apparent death was part of an even more elaborate plan." Their fears proved justified 3 days later when they reached Fort Laramie and discovered that someone had been there ahead of them, someone with official credentials and a convincing story about rogue Indians who'd attacked innocent government employees. Colonel Harrison listened to their account with growing skepticism, particularly when Clara couldn't produce Pike's body as proof of his death. "Miss Reinhardt," the colonel said carefully, "what you're describing is a conspiracy of almost unbelievable scope. You're accusing a respected federal official of planning mass murder for personal profit. I have the documents to prove it." Clara insisted, spreading Pike's coded messages across the colonel's desk. Harrison examined the papers with professional thoroughness, but his expression remained doubtful. "These could be forgeries," he said finally. "And even if they're genuine, they don't prove that Agent Pike was personally involved. For all we know, he was investigating the conspiracy himself when these criminals attacked him at the mine." Clara felt her heart sink as she realized what had happened. Pike, or someone working for him, had reached Fort Laramie first and established an official version of events that painted him as a victim rather than a perpetrator. "Colonel," Silent Rain said quietly, "the attack on Devil's Draw is supposed to happen tonight. Even if you don't believe us completely, isn't it worth sending a patrol to make sure?" Harrison considered this for a moment. "I suppose a routine patrol wouldn't hurt. But I want to be clear, I'm not authorizing any action against federal officials based on unsubstantiated accusations. It was better than nothing, but Clara knew it might not be enough. If Pike was still alive and the conspiracy was still active, a routine patrol might not be sufficient to prevent the massacre. That night, as they camped outside Fort Laramie, Clara made a decision that would change everything. "I'm going to Devil's Draw," she told Silent Rain, "with or without the Army's help." Silent Rain studied her face in the firelight, seeing the determination that had carried her through their desperate flight from Ember Ridge. "Your ankle's still injured. Pike's men are still out there, and we don't even know for sure if the attack is still planned," he said reasonably. "All the more reason to warn Iron Bear's family personally," Clara replied. "I won't have their deaths on my conscience." Silent Rain was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Then we go together," he said. "But we do it smart. No more desperate charges into burning buildings." Klaus Reinhardt, who had been listening to their conversation, cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps," he said hesitantly, "there is another way. Something I learned during my time at the mine." They turned to look at him expectantly. Pike wasn't just planning to attack Devil's Draw. Klaus continued. He was planning to stage his own rescue of the survivors, arrive just in time to drive off the rogue attackers and save the day. It would make him look like a hero while eliminating most of the witnesses. Clara felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, which means he needs some survivors to rescue. The attack won't be a complete massacre. It will be carefully staged to leave a few witnesses who can testify to Pike's heroism. Witnesses who will be too traumatized to notice inconsistencies in his story. Silent Rain added grimly. It was a brilliant plan, and it meant Pike was definitely still alive. The man they'd left for dead in the flooded mine had somehow escaped and was proceeding with his original conspiracy modified to account for the changed circumstances. But it also gave them an opportunity. If they could reach Devil's Draw ahead of Pike's attack and prepare the families for what was coming, they might be able to turn the trap against the conspirators. The race to Devil's Draw took them across some of the most dangerous country in the territory. Winter weather had made the trails treacherous, and Pike's surviving men were undoubtedly watching for any sign of Clara and her companions. But Silent Rain's knowledge of the land proved invaluable once again. Using hunting trails and hidden paths known only to his people, he guided them through country that would have been impassable to anyone else. They reached Iron Bear's winter camp just as the sun was setting on what might be the family's last day of peace. The camp was a collection of traditional lodges and cabins scattered along a sheltered creek bottom. Smoke rose from cook fires, and Clara could hear the sound of children playing in the snow. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that made Pike's planned attack seem even more monstrous. Iron Bear himself was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and the bearing of a natural leader. His initial reaction to Silent Rain's arrival was coolly polite rather than welcoming. The shame of his supposed cowardice still lingered between them. But when Silent Rain explained the danger and showed Iron Bear the evidence of Pike's conspiracy, the older man's attitude changed dramatically. "You risked your life to warn us," Iron Bear said simply. "That is not the action of a coward." "I should have been there when Running Wolf died," Silent Rain replied. "You should have done exactly what you did," Iron Bear interrupted. "You were scouting as ordered. The attack came from an unexpected direction, and you tried to outflank the enemy to save us all. Running Wolf's death was not your fault." For the first time in months, Silent Rain felt the weight of shame and guilt begin to lift from his shoulders. The approval of Iron Bear, one of the most respected warriors in their band, meant more to him than any official vindication. But there was no time for lengthy reconciliations. Pike's attack was scheduled for some time after midnight, and they had less than 6 hours to prepare. Iron Bear quickly organized the camp's defenses, positioning his best warriors at strategic points around the perimeter, while moving the women, children, and elderly to more secure positions. But Clara could see that the families were badly outnumbered, perhaps 30 fighting men, against what might be 50 or more of Pike's hired guns. "We need help," she said urgently. "What about the Army patrol Colonel Harrison promised to send?" Silent Rain studied the darkening sky with growing concern. "They should have been here by now. Either they were delayed or someone made sure they never left Fort Laramie." Clara finished grimly. It was beginning to look like Iron Bear's families would have to face Pike's attack alone. But as they made their final preparations, unexpected help arrived from an unlikely source. Deputy Walt Wade rode into camp with a dozen territorial militiamen, and their faces grim and their weapons ready for action. "Figured you might need some backup," Wade said simply. "Had a talk with some of the other deputies about Pike's operation. Turns out a lot of folks have been suspicious of that snake for years." The reinforcements were welcome, but Clara knew they were still outnumbered. Pike's plan had been in development for months, and he'd assembled a small army of professional killers for the final attack. At 11 o'clock, Silent Rain scouts reported movement in the hills around the camp. The attack was beginning. Pike had planned his assault with military precision. 3 groups of attackers would strike simultaneously from different directions, creating maximum confusion, while making it appear that the families were being overwhelmed by superior numbers. The first shots rang out just after midnight, shattering the winter stillness with their deadly message. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness as Pike's men opened fire from concealed positions around the camp perimeter. But this time, the families were ready. Iron Bear's warriors had spent hours preparing defensive positions and interlocking fields of fire. When Pike's men charged out of the darkness, expecting to find helpless victims, they instead ran into a wall of disciplined resistance. The battle that followed was fierce and protracted. Pike's hired guns were professionals, but they were also mercenaries fighting for money rather than survival. The defenders were fighting for their families, their homes, and their very existence. Silent Rain positioned himself at the camp's eastern approach, where the terrain funneled attackers into a narrow killing ground. His rifle spoke with deadly precision, each shot dropping one of Pike's gunmen. But for every enemy he killed, Two more seemed to take their place. Clara had organized the women and older children into a medical corps treating wounded warriors and keeping ammunition supplied to the firing line. Her bundle of evidence remained with her, but she'd also armed herself with one of the camp's spare rifles. Deputy Wade commanded his militiamen from the camp's northern edge, where Pike's main assault was developing. The deputy had fought in the Civil War and knew how to make every shot count, but the attackers kept coming in waves. "They're trying to overwhelm us with numbers," Wade shouted to Iron Bear during a brief lull in the fighting. "Professional tactic make us expend ammunition faster than we can resupply." Iron Bear nodded grimly. "How long can we hold?" "Depends on how many men Pike brought and how much they're willing to lose," Wade replied, reloading his rifle. "But we can't keep this up indefinitely." The battle raged for over an hour, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Pike's men had superior numbers and equipment, but the defenders had better positions and stronger motivation. Then, just as ammunition was running critically low, the tide began to turn. Iron Bear's nephew, Swift Eagle, had been sent earlier to contact other Allied bands in the region. Now he returned with nearly 40 mounted warriors who struck Pike's forces from behind, catching the attackers between two fires. The surprise attack shattered Pike's carefully planned assault. His hired guns, already demoralized by heavier casualties than expected, began breaking and running, rather than face destruction between the hammer and anvil of the combined native forces. But Pike himself was still nowhere to be seen during the fighting, and Clara knew the corrupt agent was too clever to risk himself in direct combat. She found him where she should have expected, near the camp's main lodge, setting fire to structures and shooting fleeing women and children. Even in defeat, Pike was trying to create the massacre he needed to justify his version of events. In the flickering light of burning buildings, Clara could see that Pike was wounded. Blood soaked his left arm, where Silent Rain's knife had found its mark in the mine. But he was still mobile and still deadly. "Stop!" Clara shouted, raising her rifle. Pike turned to face her, his civilized mask finally stripped away to reveal the monster beneath. His expensive clothes were torn and muddy, his graying hair disheveled, and his eyes burned with the fury of a man whose carefully laid plans had been destroyed. "Miss Clara Reinhardt," he snarled. "Still causing trouble, I see." "It's over, Pike. Your men are dead or scattered, and everyone knows the truth about your conspiracy." Pike's laugh was bitter as winter wind. The truth is that progress requires sacrifice. And sometimes good people have to die so that civilization can advance. These savages are standing in the way of America's destiny. These savages are human beings with families and homes and the same right to live that you claim for yourself. Pretty words, miss. But the world doesn't run on pretty words. It runs on power and the strong taking what they need from the weak. Ner. Pike raised his pistol, but before he could fire, a small figure darted between them. Iron Bear's 6-year-old granddaughter, Little Dove, had become separated from the other children in the chaos of battle. Pike's face twisted with cruel calculation as he grabbed the child, pressing his gun to her head. "Drop your weapon, Miss Reinhardt," he ordered coldly, "or I'll paint these lodge walls with this little one's brains." Clara felt her heart stop as she looked into Little Dove's terrified eyes. The child was trembling but trying to be brave, just as her warrior grandfather had taught her. "Please," Clara said quietly. "She's just a baby. She hasn't done anything to hurt you." "She's a symbol," Pike replied harshly. "A symbol of everything that's holding back progress in this territory. Her death will serve a purpose just like all the others." Clara's mind raced, looking for any option that might save the child without giving Pike the chance to escape. But the corrupt agent had positioned himself perfectly, using Little Dove as a human shield while keeping his back to a burning lodge. "You have 10 seconds to decide, Miss Reinhardt," Pike continued. "Drop the rifle and hand over those documents, or this child dies." Clara's finger tightened on her rifle's trigger, but she couldn't risk a shot with Little Dove in the line of fire. Slowly, reluctantly, she began to lower her weapon. That's when Little Dove proved she was truly Iron Bear's granddaughter. The child bit down hard on Pike's gun hand, her small teeth finding the pressure point between thumb and forefinger. Pike cursed and jerked his hand away instinctively, giving Clara the opening she needed. Her shot took Pike's center mass, the heavy rifle bullet spinning him around and sending him crashing into the burning lodge behind him. But even as he fell, Pike managed one final act of spite. He triggered the explosive charges he'd planted throughout the camp. The blast was tremendous, sending flaming debris in all directions and setting fire to several more buildings. Clara threw herself over Little Dove, shielding the child from falling timber and burning embers. When the smoke cleared, Pike was gone, consumed by the fires he'd started in a final desperate attempt to create the massacre that would vindicate his twisted vision of progress. The battle for Devil's Draw was over, but the cost had been terrible. 7 warriors were dead, another dozen wounded, and much of the camp lay in ruins. But Iron Bear's people were alive, and Pike's conspiracy was finally ended. As dawn broke over the devastated camp, Clara found herself holding Little Dove, while the child's family searched for survivors among the wreckage. The bundle of evidence that had started their entire adventure was still clutched in her other hand, now stained with smoke and blood, but intact. Silent Rain approached his left arm in a makeshift sling from a bullet wound received during the fighting. "It's finished," he said quietly. "Pike's men who survived the battle are being rounded up by Wade's militia. The conspiracy dies with them." Clara looked around at the destruction Pike's greed had caused: the burned buildings, the grieving families, the children who would grow up without fathers. Even in victory, the cost seemed almost too high to bear. "Was it worth it?" she asked. "All this death and suffering?" Silent Rain followed her gaze, seeing the same devastation, but also something else. Iron Bear's people already beginning to rebuild, already planning for a future that Pike would never be able to threaten again. "Ask me in 10 years, he said finally, "when these children are grown and living in peace. When the territory has learned that different peoples can coexist without one destroying the other. Then we'll know if it was worth it." The trials and investigations that followed were the sensation of the territorial press. Pike's surviving men were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 5 years to life. Cattleman Vane was arrested at his ranch and eventually hanged for his crimes. The territorial government launched a comprehensive investigation of the Indian Agency, uncovering years of corruption and abuse. Morrison, rescued from his bonds 3 days after their departure, turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony filled in crucial details about Pike's operation and helped convict the remaining conspirators. But the legal proceedings took months, during which Clara had to testify repeatedly about her role in exposing the conspiracy. The attention was overwhelming for someone who'd spent years living in obscurity, and she found herself longing for the simple peace of frontier life. Through it all, Silent Rain remained at her side. His own reputation had been completely restored when Army investigators uncovered the truth about his brother's death. Running Wolf had been killed by Crow sharpshooters, while Silent Rain was attempting to outflank the enemy position exactly as he'd claimed all along. The tribal council formally apologized for their error and offered Silent Rain a position as war chief, but he declined. His experiences during the conspiracy had given him a different perspective on leadership and responsibility. "What will you do now?" Clara asked as they stood outside the courthouse in Miles City after the final trial. Silent Rain looked around at the bustling territorial capital and then back at her. That depends on you. On me. I've been offered a position as interpreter and agency scout at Pine Butte Agency. Help prevent the kind of misunderstandings that lead to violence. His dark eyes were serious. But I only want it if you'll be there too. Clara felt her heart race at the implications of his words. What are you asking? I'm asking you to marry me, Clara Reinhardt, to build a life with me where both our peoples can find peace. She looked into his face, seeing the man who'd risked everything to save her, who'd stood by her through the darkest hours of her life. The answer came without hesitation. Yes. They were married 3 months later in a ceremony that blended Lakota traditions with territorial law. Iron Bear performed the tribal rituals, while the agency administrator handled the legal requirements, creating a union recognized by both communities. The wedding feast was a celebration of more than just their marriage. It was a symbol of hope for peaceful coexistence between two peoples who'd been enemies for too long. Clara wore a dress of white doeskin decorated with intricate beadwork, while Silent Rain was magnificent in traditional warrior regalia that had belonged to his grandfather. Klaus Reinhardt, recovered from his ordeal at the mine, walked his daughter down the aisle with tears of pride and joy streaming down his weathered face. The years of separation had been painful for both of them, but they'd found their way back to each other. As they danced under the stars to the rhythm of ancient drums, Clara marveled at the journey that had brought them together. The frightened telegraph operator who'd whispered for help in a burning building was gone, replaced by a woman who'd found her courage, her purpose, and her heart's true home. Their first child was born the following spring, a daughter they named Hope in English and New Dawn in Lakota. She was followed 2 years later by a son they called John Klaus, in honor of Clara's father, and Swift Arrow in the language of his people. Life at Pine Butte Agency wasn't always easy. Clara faced prejudice from some white settlers who couldn't accept her choice to live among Indians, while a few tribal members questioned whether an outsider could truly understand their ways. But the strong support of Iron Bear's family and the respect Clara earned through her work overcame most opposition. She established a school that taught both English and Lakota, helping children from both communities learn to communicate across cultural barriers. Silent Rain's position as interpreter and agency scout grew in importance as more conflicts arose between settlers and native peoples, and his reputation for fairness and wisdom spread throughout the territory. But it was the quiet moments Clara treasured most evenings spent on their porch, watching their children play with their cousins, listening to Silent Rain tell the old stories, feeling the deep contentment that came from belonging somewhere completely. Any regrets? Silent Rain asked one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, and listening to the sound of their children's laughter. In the distance, she could see the lights of the agency buildings and the smoke rising from traditional lodges, symbols of two peoples learning to live in harmony. None, she said firmly. Not a single one. Silent Rain's arm tightened around her. Me neither. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara thought about the desperate journey that had brought them together. She'd whispered, "Get me out of here," in a moment of terror, not knowing that salvation would come in the form of a Lakota warrior seeking his own redemption. He had gotten her out, not just from physical danger, but from a life of loneliness and purposelessness. And in saving her, she'd helped him find his way back to honor and belonging among his people.